So I've been doing these curious about coaching sessions. I do them every once in a while with the idea that many people don't know what coaching is about. And they're also an opportunity for me to share some fun concept that I have been thinking about or giving a talk about somewhere else. And tonight I was going to talk about prioritizing the pause. And I'm really like this topic because the pause is something that's super hard for people in medicine. We don't know how to pause. And in fact, we were trained in medicine to think otherwise, that the pause and the rest is not worthwhile. It might be lazy, it might be complacent. Many of us were taught we would fall behind if we paused or rest along the way in our training in medicine. And then when we get into our real lives and real jobs, we also have this impending sense of doom when we rest, that our inbox will blow up or the things will get out of control. And so we tend to not rest, and we tend to stay hyper vigilant about being busy. The other thing is that in medicine, we tend to glorify being busy, and also being empty and exhausted and not pausing. And that is the culture. And in fact, if you think back around our training, the busier you were, we sort of talked about it was a badge of honor or a source of pride if you were busy and made it through. And so talking about this prioritizing a pause to me feels it's a little bit renegade in the sense that I am advocating that it's actually a productivity tool and really important and something that most of us don't do. And so calling out this addiction to busy, which is what I like to think about it, and productivity is really important for us to see that we are comfortable when we're busy and not pausing. And most people who decide to pause are very uncomfortable. And so a pause and a rest is actually a productivity tool. It's a performance tool, and it's, as I would say, a happiness tool or a contentment tool. If we don't do that, we are not content. It's also a relationship tool and a communication tool. And so I'm going to talk about it in all those realms. And so I like to think of prioritizing the pause as actually strategic. The more you pause, the more you do, the more you need to pause and rest. And so most of us don't equate those two. It's the more we do, we don't have time to rest. But the more you do, you actually need to do more rest to recover. And thinking about pauses as essential to preventing burnout. They are actually efficient to have micro and macro pauses. And so I'm hoping that you will all leave feeling like the more you do, the more you need to rest, and figure out how to make that a reality. And I know many of you think you don't have time, but I would say you don't have time not to rest. And that also understanding a little bit, there is science around resting, taking breaks. And there's a lot of evidence in medicine that we need to rest and take breaks. And then what you do in the pause is equally important. So not just prioritizing the pause, but making sure your pause is not buffering with Netflix, or it's not, a lot of people use vacation pauses to do all the things from a scarcity mindset, and then you are not replenishing yourself. And so equally important to prioritizing the pause is what you do with the pause. And so I like to think, our, not just in medicine, but our society basically values being busy and not pausing. And there's all of this rushing and urgency that I often talk about, and that when we try to slow down, we are super uncomfortable. And so I think realizing that if you choose to take a pause and you don't plan it every minute of it, many people feel very uncomfortable. And so they go back to things that are not pausing, like listening to podcasts or exercising, and as opposed to really resting. And resting is not sleeping, although we all do need to sleep, but that's not what a pause is. It's a pause is brain rest, it's mind rest, and the mind rest is often mindfulness that comes in the pause. And so realizing that it's taking that pause where you're not actually doing anything, you're potentially being, you might be practicing mindfulness, you might be practicing yoga, you might be breathing, you might literally be just sitting in nature. But for so many of us, the pause is actually very uncomfortable. And so I like to call that out in the beginning because a lot of people feel like, oh, they get the pause and they should feel better, and they don't. So what I thought I would do is actually start with a bit of a pause so that you all can feel the pause and take a moment of pause for yourself. And so finding your sit bones and just connecting them into whatever you're sitting upon. And you'll tilt your pelvic bowl forward and align your spine. And if it feels good, you can close your eyes. And if it doesn't, you can just have a light, loose gaze. And we'll just take a few breaths. Just noticing that a few inhales and exhales can make a big difference. And just notice the breath coming in through your nose and out through your mouth. And then if it would feel good, bring a hand to heart as part of your pause. Noticing the pressure on your chest and the hand on hand, hand on heart. And envisioning that oxytocin circulating around that we know happens when we bring hand to heart. And the cortisol melting from the skin to skin. And allowing yourself to enjoy a moment here, simply breathing with your hand on your heart or your chest and noticing how you feel. And you can slowly lower your hands and we'll open our eyes. And I made that intentionally short to notice how you feel, even with a tiny micro pause, that's available to you wherever you work in the moment in between patients, in the ER. I find even simply the hand to heart doing that creates this nanosecond moment of pause. And in that pause is where you can shift everything. And noticing after you have practiced a pause that your nervous system feels different. And one of the invitations of the pause is actually to upregulate your parasympathetic nervous system and downregulate your sympathetic nervous system. Knowing that we can't change in our mindset how we approach the world, we can't show up with intention if we are in fight or flight. We just react in fight or flight. Pause is also designed to replete you in some way. In my mind, it repletes energy, but sometimes it repletes your spirit, your sense of fun, maybe perspective. It gets you out of that autopilot. And when you can use a pause to replete you, you can also choose to show up intentionally. So many people try to do coaching and change the way that they move through the world from complete empty. And we don't change when we are completely empty and depleted. And so realizing that this pause, even tiny micro pauses, that one was probably a minute, can give you back some energy with which you can then move forward more intentionally and potentially get less depleted, but also replete yourself at the same time. And so this pause, rest, and I like to call it rejuvenation. That's what gives you the opportunity to move forward intentionally. And we know that it improves performance. We know that it improves health. We know that it improves all kinds of things. Knowing, though, that it takes time, a little bit of time, but it takes intention to make it happen. And that we often say we don't have time. And I want to encourage you again, if you don't have time, you need to pause even more. And that there's always time to pause, even for these microseconds. If it's one breath, that when done with intention can really shift. We know it shifts your physiology. That impacts your nervous system, which then spirals on itself. It's a little bit like a snowball, and you're getting more and more effect. And so thinking about the pause as just this critically important thing, which can be tiny, it can be big, it could be a sabbatical, it could be one breath. And so realizing that pause there's a famous quote that says the pause is where your power and control lie. And so if you pause, even for a nanosecond, where you then respond rather than react, that's where you get to show up with intention rather than autopilot. And our autopilot in medicine is generally complaining, focusing on the negative, being a victim, noticing what's wrong, catastrophizing, fixing, managing, controlling. Oftentimes we go to guilt, blame, and shame. These were all things that we were trained to do. And so when we are in autopilot and we go there when we are tired and depleted and haven't had a pause or a break, it actually spirals and makes things worse. And so if you pause, you can notice those patterns, you can see them, most of us don't think about them, but we can feel them. We feel that tension. We know we're on our old paths of stressful reactions. And so the pause is where you get your power back and you get to choose, am I gonna go to one of these default thought patterns, which might have been helpful at some point in your career, but might not be helpful now, or you're gonna choose something more intentional moving forward. The other thing about that pause is when you pause, you actually have space to listen to yourself, and potentially listen to others, but mostly to yourself, because we were taught not to listen in medicine. We were actually taught to react and taught to not pause to listen to maybe what you want, not listen to the fact that you need to use the restroom or you're exhausted or you're hungry. You're just supposed to keep going. So when we choose to pause, we can actually notice what we need. Many people say that they find clarity in a pause, and that might be more than the nanosecond pause. But when you take a sabbatical, that's when people find clarity. When they go on a retreat, that's when they find clarity, because they give themselves that time and space. And most of us in our days don't give ourselves the time and space. And when we don't have clarity, again, we're in this reactive mode where we're not focusing on what's most important. And that is often inefficient and not performing to our highest potential. And so if you think about that, taking pauses are critical to allow you to sort of structure and move forward in ways that work better for you and potentially are more aligned. When we are out of alignment, everything takes a lot more energy and we end up much more burnt out and tired. So pauses also allow us to connect, and they allow us to connect to ourselves. That's a bit of the listening. And so many of us feel like, I hear this often with people who come for coaching, I've lost myself. I don't know where I am. I don't know what's happening. I don't know. I used to be this person, but I don't know who I am now. And that's generally because you prioritized everything but yourself. And you haven't even paused to figure out what matters to you. And so you feel like you've lost yourself. Pausing is the key thing. Pausing probably more than just a breath, but figuring out, can you take some time off? Can you take a weekend away from your responsibilities? Can you go on a retreat? Can you take a sabbatical? All those things can be really helpful in finding yourself. And many of us feel like we don't have time to do it. And I would say you don't have time not to do it. So many people are leaving medicine. And if they took a pause and regrounded themselves and figured out how to be aligned, which is what I see often, they can find a way to stay and practice that gets back to why they went into it. Most of us went into it for pretty good reasons, and we love the work, but we are off track. And these pauses allow us to notice and reconnect to ourselves. I also think that I know that pauses allow you to connect to other people. And many of us are very disconnected from those we love, our partners, our children. I'm thinking one person here is still very connected to her pet, but that's because pets that demand that you pause with them. They don't let you off the hook. But I think we often feel very disconnected. And if we don't take the pause and actually are present in it, giving ourselves the attention and that presence to connect in that pause, our relationships very much suffer. And this idea of pauses in communication, I think, is really cool, because most of us have an urgency bias. Most of us talk really fast. We don't give people a chance to respond or listen. And so if you include pauses in, we call it mindful communication, it gives the other person a chance to listen to you. And the more complicated or emotionally heavy thing you're saying, you actually need to include more pauses so that people can absorb it. And most of us in medicine don't do that. We actually talk faster when it's complicated and emotionally heavy, and same with partners. So the pause allows them to listen. Pauses also allow you to listen to the other person. Now, again, what you do in the pause matters. So oftentimes we are calculating our response the whole time and not actually listening. And so realizing that it's that space and choosing with intention what you want to do. But I think for many of us, we just tend to rush and be urgent, whether it's in our day or in our communication. We want to get the problem solved, especially with children. I'm a pediatrician by training. And so if you think about kids, they react to the pace and the urgency, they react to the energy. And so when you pause intentionally, you have a very different energy. And most of the time in our clinic visits, when we pause, the clinic visit actually goes faster because they have time to understand and listen. And that can be a really valuable change. And so for me, I actually practice pausing. And I will say, my husband is a lawyer, and he has done a couple of podcasts recently with me on negotiating and depositions. And he says that doctors don't pause. And so what the lawyers do in those situations is they actually pause because they know we will jump in and give them more information. And so that tells you that that's just our natural. And so I encourage you, at least in those settings, to pause. Same thing like when you're arguing with your spouse or having a negotiation. We're very uncomfortable in the pause. And so we jump in and try to come up with a compromise or solve the problem. And people please, we want people to think that we're doing a good job. And so the pause can actually be your strength and very strategic. And so thinking about it that way in communication, I don't like it when other people are manipulating me. So I'm like, I'm going to pause now. I'm not going to jump in no matter how long my husband pauses. I'm like, I'm going to let him go next because he's had that training and I have not. So pauses also replete you. And if you use your pause strategically, you can actually replete yourself so you have more energy. And I like to think of energy maintenance or management rather than say time management, because you can manage your time well, but if you end up at the end of the day completely exhausted with nothing left for what matters, it doesn't matter if you managed your time well. And that if you're thinking about your energy management, you can end the day with energy. That as actually a win. Or if you can hit a weekend with energy or a vacation with energy, you're not going into your pause just completely depleted. So you have to pause along the way. And there's actually this great book called Sacred Rest. I might have it here, which is written by an internal medicine doctor. And she actually talks about like actually resting and what's wrong with us when we don't rest. And I think it's really a valuable way to think about burnout. The other way I like to think about rest is that professional athletes rest. They have recovery days in their training. Physicians don't have recovery days, but they have recovery days. That's what the pause is. And it's actually designed so that you have space to recover, you have space to replete. And we actually work way harder than professional athletes. Our days are longer, especially if you're surgeons or ER docs, and we have more important work to do, and that people are potentially living or dying based on what we do. And then our careers are a lot longer. And so learning from them, they all have mindset coaches, they all have nutrition coaches, they have sleep coaches, and they have recovery days. So if nothing else, take their recovery day and realize that it's essential for their high performance. And our high performance is important, not just because we want to feel good about what we do, but because what we do is so important. And so for me, that's really helpful in prioritizing a pause. If they need a pause to recover, then we all do too. And we know from lots of research that that's where the healing happens. That's where the restoration happens. That's where health actually happens. And there's studies to show that pausing and taking breaks actually improves your health. It improves your nervous system health and that balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic. It also makes you more aware so you don't get repetitive stress injuries. You notice when something is not right. Think about how many doctors get diagnosed with something terrible and they didn't even notice the symptoms because they never paused to notice. And so we know that the pausing and taking breaks is really important for your health and preventing injuries. And it breaks / pauses increase productivity. There's tons of studies about this. This is why the Google people all take breaks and have break rooms, but we never do. And I was coaching someone in internal medicine the other day, and she just said, well, no, I just work through lunch and I do all of this. And then I get so tired. And it's like, you take a break in the middle, it actually resets your energy. Go out and get some fresh air. We know that we focus better, and we know that our energy balance stays in the positive rather than empty or negative. And I think if we can take responsibility for that, it's actually going to keep you out of burnout. Now, this isn't to say that the system isn't broken and doesn't need to be fixed and it's our fault. It's not. It's just to say that if you're going to keep working in it, that doing all the things you can do to help yourself is better. And realizing that the way we were trained to think that not pausing is important, doing more and more and more and longer is somehow a badge of honor is actually not scientifically the way to have a long and healthy career. It takes a toll eventually. Maybe in our 20s we could do it, but we can't keep doing it forever. You hit a point where you can't continue on. And I like to sometimes go back to the heart, if you think about it. So the heart pauses in diastole and it fills. And so if we don't pause, we end up similarly in diastolic dysfunction if we don't refill. And when you have diastolic dysfunction, you have systolic dysfunction ultimately, and you go into heart failure. And I'm a kid doctor, so that's the extent of my knowledge there. But I think it helped me really think, well, the heart is there for the duration. It runs the marathon, not the sprint. And so there are a lot of lessons from that. Same thing with the breath. The breath has a pause at the top and the bottom to switch directions. And so if you think about the physiology, that's actually how we have healthy patterns that are the things that keep us going and going. And so learning from our physiology, since we're all doctors, feels really good. If you don't pause, you end up reacting, which, as I mentioned before, that is usually wastes energy. So you send those reactive emails, you yell and pick fights, you cause more problems that then you have to clean up later. And we tend to, when we don't pause, feel overwhelmed, we're frustrated, we tend to be making decisions from fear and guilt and uncertainty. And so pausing is actually the antidote to all of those things. If you can take these little micro pauses, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that, you actually can get out of that autopilot. And that's where you can begin to just make the slight shifts. I like to think of change as a direction. You don't have to change everything all at once. You can do 1%, 5%. So even slight little micro pauses, a 5-minute pause, or even pausing for 3 deep breaths. I used to do that in peds at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because that was the bewitching hour when everybody had to come in, and the people wanted their checkups in the afternoon. The daycare called and they were sick, and it was after work, and it was just the busiest time. And I used to eat chocolate before I did my mindfulness work. And what I discovered is that you eat the chocolate, that's fine, and then you crash when you have to do your charts afterwards. And so if you breathe instead of chocolate, I had a little note on my computer to do that, which is a pause, you feel better. And so I had this rule that I had to do 3 or 4 deep breaths first, and then if I wanted the chocolate, I could have it. But it actually shifts your energy, and very often you don't need it, and it takes less time. You don't have to rinse your mouth out after you eat the chocolate before you go in to see the patient. So I think really strategizing and figuring out how you can take a pause. And so for some people, reminders work. So that sticky on my computer was really great. You can set your phone to take a break, and you can decide in advance, like where can you have a break, or you can force yourself to take a break. One of my other strategies was to order myself a coffee on the Starbucks app, which was 1 block away, in the middle of the afternoon, and I would have to run and get it. But it meant, and this is silly, but I had paid for it. So it was sitting there and I didn't want it cold, which meant that it forced me to take a 5-minute break, and I could literally get there and back, because if you order it, it's waiting for you. And all of a sudden that resets your afternoon. Now you are drinking coffee, but it gets you out in the fresh air, and it makes you do something that you otherwise might not do. So setting yourself up for these little things can, and working with your own brain, knowing I knew that if I didn't order it, I was not going to go outside and take a breath of fresh air all day. So this made sure that I did that. The other thing is to make your meals a break. And most of us will eat at our computers, or not in a beautiful setting, not with a nice view. And one of the things that we don't realize, and this is something I bring up a lot at retreats, is it's not just what you eat, it's where you eat and who you eat with and how you feel when you eat. That all impacts what you absorb and whether it's nourishing or not. So you can eat the best farmer's market salad, but if you eat it in front of your computer while you're stressed out answering emails, it's going to have a very different impact physiologically than if you go outside and eat for 5 or 10 minutes. And so thinking about how you feel when you eat, can you take a few breaths before you eat? Can you pause for 10 minutes and eat? And I think that doing that shift makes you feel much more nourished and replete before you start your next. For me, it was always the afternoon. I don't know what kind of doctor all of you are, but whatever it is, really thinking about, there are a lot of studies about not working during meals. And most of us in medicine, it's kind of sad, work while we eat while we work. And so I think really realizing, and it's one of the reasons why many of us have issues with our weight, because we never feel like we got nourishing food, and so we want something else to make up for it, and we haven't taken that break, so we eat to make up for the exhaustion, for example. And so pausing and really enjoying your meal, making it an event or a break, even if it's 10 minutes, can make a big difference. So other things you can do in a pause, to me, it's choosing things that genuinely feel good. So in coaching, we call things that feel good in the moment, but aren't actually good for you, buffering. So that would be like surfing the internet, or scrolling on Facebook, or potentially watching Netflix, depending on how it impacts you. So really it's looking at, does it energize you or does it deplete you? And I encourage people that I work with to actually make a list. What is energizing? What is depleting? And in your break, do something that's energizing. So it might be standing up. It might be taking 3 deep breaths. It might be, for me, even hand to heart is energizing, or looking out the window, noticing what kinds of things energize you and deplete you. And one of the things I would add here is thoughts about things can actually energize and deplete us. So if you are being angsty about your charts, or you're thinking like, oh, I have so many emails today, it's not right. I was talking to someone just before this, it's unreasonable expectations in those emails, or unreasonable complaints from patients. If you're thinking about it that way, that depletes you. And so if you look at your in basket and you think, this is what I used to tell myself, so many people want to talk to me today, or they want my advice, because this is pediatrics. I always wanted, instead of thinking about they could get that advice from somewhere else, why are they asking me this? So telling yourself a narrative that energizes you rather than depletes you in the pause, even in that microsecond pause, can make a big difference. And so I think you really need to be clear what energizes you and depletes you, and adding in even 1% more of things that energize you in your day will make a difference. And so I often suggest to people that mindfulness energizes us, and it can be literally breathing energizes you. If you think about the shift of the oxygen and carbon dioxide, it actually really does shift the energy in your body. And so learning some different breathing patterns can be super helpful. So I often teach box breathing, which is the 4-4-4-4. That is the focus energy breathing. You might actually want calm breathing. So a lot of ER docs and shift workers will do 4-7-8 breaths, which are to activate your parasympathetic. So that means you breathe in for 4, out for in for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. The point of that, I like to keep things super basic, is that the exhale is longer than the inhale. And so that's what I think, like exhale longer than the inhale, that's relaxing. If you're matching everything up, that wakes you up and helps you focus. And so I actually don't do counted breaths. I always like to be really transparent. I don't like 4-7-8 because I don't like holding my breath that long. It stresses me out. So you need to figure out, when you practice these things, what works for you. So I do more of the yoga breath, and I am a yoga teacher. So that's partly where I learned all this breathing, which is samavriti, which is equal parts breath. So breathing in the same depth and energetic force as you breathe out. For me, that's kind of fun to try to figure out, did I do it equally? And it's very relaxing. And so just breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth can make a big difference. And when I first became a yoga teacher, that was the thing that I noticed. All of my colleagues held their breath. every time I would go to a doctor conference, everyone's standing there holding their breath. And so if you can learn one thing, learn how to breathe and pause at the top of the inhale and at the bottom of the exhale. And your physiology will shift. You'll all of a sudden feel more calm. You don't have to pay attention to your breath all the time, but when you're feeling off, just pause and breathe. You can pause and breathe when you go into an exam room, like when you grab the handle of the door, pause and take a deep breath. That's another way to do it. I also used to breathe with my patients. So when I'm listening, I would sit there and breathe with them, even toddlers, just breathe longer, because I'm actually breathing for me, but nobody else knows that. And it's kind of nice, mom seeing you breathe, they start breathing, everyone starts breathing, it's better. And so I think really using that as a pause in your visit can shift the energy for everyone. And that's why the pause is sort of this magical energy shifting moment where you can go from autopilot to depletion to repletion or a reset. Like if the energy in the exam room is crazy, because sometimes in peds it is, you can pause and sort of hit this reset, and all of a sudden everybody shows up differently with breathing, for example. The other thing you can do is mindfulness, and I like to recommend doing it in the transition. So between home and work and home, not while you're driving, but like in the parking lot before you go in with a totally different energy. And if you want to meditate on your mat for 45 minutes, you can. That's the typical mindfulness-based stress reduction. But I find like 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute can really help most doctors. So don't overcomplicate it. Get an app, push the button, do what they say. And if you do it in the transitions, it's really much more powerful. And so if you are going from work to home, depending on whether you have small kids or not, pause somewhere in the driveway, in the garage, or a few blocks away and do 5 minutes of mindfulness or 2 minutes. You'll show up with totally different energy for your family and those people that you love. And your evening, you then don't go into your autopilot, sabotaging, reacting mode that you then have to clean up from. And it can make a huge difference. Other ways of practicing mindfulness that it doesn't have to be complicated. Hand to heart, which is self-compassion, is, you can't see me, but I do it all the time. And there's a lot of science around what it does to your neurochemicals, and you're changing what you're bathing your cells in. That's going to take great advantage of a pause. So again, you can just do this. That's a micro pause, but it shifts your brain instantly. For me, it's the tactile shift. And now that I have been practicing it, I don't even have to pause to get the benefit. Like I immediately feel a shift in the chest. And a lot of this takes practice. You have to practice it for it to make a difference. And so many of us are like, nope, that hand to heart thing does nothing for me. Well, it does nothing for you the first few times you do it. But once you practice it, your whole nervous system can literally drop in pretty quickly. Same thing for me with the breathing. Like if I just start breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth, I drop into that more calm state. And so the more you practice this stuff and the more you practice the pausing, the more natural it becomes. The other thing about mindfulness is that the more you practice it, that pause between the stimulus and the response lengthens. And so you're more likely to catch yourself before you go into your autopilot old habits. And so it's worth practicing it regularly, even when you're not stressed, because then you'll have that ability to jump in and notice and be more aware and cut off those guilt, shame, blame, fear-based decision-making and things like that, which are going to make your life a lot harder than it needs to be. Another thing I like to bring up, and I forgot again, but if you have a yoga block, you can put it on your desk. And many of us, just putting your third eye down on a block can create this pause that shifts and resets. So for those people with spinny minds, monkey minds, which most of us have, if you find it hard to relax, you can't just sit there and drop in. You put your head on a block, it shifts things immediately. I have a lot of doctors who work with me who now have a cork. Yoga block works better than the foam for this. And you literally put it on your desk, you put your head down, close your eyes, and in 30 seconds, you feel like a new woman. Since everyone here is a woman, I can say that. So I recommend trying that. It's a beautiful thing. And then the other practice I just wanted to share is restorative yin or gentle yoga. And you can go do a whole class on these. They are a pause and they will restore you. But You can also do a single pose, and that can restore you for 5 minutes. And so part of the purpose of going to a class is to figure out which poses are the ones that are like the one that works for you. And this is something I work on at retreats a lot, is which one works for you, which version is comfortable, which setup, so that when you get home, for example, you put your feet up the wall for 5 minutes and you have this whole physiologic reset, and then you go about your evening. And that 5-minute pause has a huge positive impact. And so when you learn the poses that work for you, it can be a really quick way to reset. A whole hour of restorative yoga is, of course, better. And many people think, well, I'm just lying there, but it's nervous system retraining. And most of us are in sympathomimetic storm all the time. That's reactive mode. There's no pause there. And we don't move through intentionally. And then we wonder at the end of the day, why am I so burnt out? Why am I exhausted? How did I end up here? And so practicing these and training your nervous system to be able to even itself out is really a helpful tool. So last reminders are really just thinking about expecting discomfort when you rest and pause, because it's very uncomfortable. And everybody who first starts, even hand to heart's uncomfortable. Just pausing and breathing is uncomfortable. Even taking a day where you pause and you're not in your to-do list can be very uncomfortable. And part of the reason for that is that we're not used to it. So anything that's unfamiliar is uncomfortable. But our doctor brains, or our medical trained brain, sees discomfort as dangerous, right? Because we are trained to look at our intuition. When we're uncomfortable, it's something bad's going to happen. And so then we go out of that pause and go into doing something, buffering to make it go away. And then you never get the benefit of the pause. And so accepting that it's uncomfortable, and then it gets less uncomfortable over time. I always say what you practice grows. So you've been practicing this urgency, lack of pause, making everything harder for a long time. When you shift, it takes time to practice something new and let the old practices recede. And so give yourself time to do that. And I thought I would just end with a few questions, thinking about if you happen to be addicted to that busy, action, moving, doing, urgency. And is this idea of true rest or relaxation, is it hard for you or uncomfortable for you? And what stories do you tell yourself about the value of rest and recovery? Does it bring in guilt? Does it bring in, I should be doing something else, I'm being unproductive? Or can you relabel rest as productive?